Ballad of the Wilderness, Chapter 4, First Part. The sun went down. The curtain came up on the time of the nobility. He chose not the forest for their camp, but rather the middle of the plain. There was no guarantee that this location would be entirely safe, but being out on the plain gave an unobstructed view on all sides, which was clearly better than being in a forest, where supernatural creatures crawled under cover of bushes, or lurked behind trees. Collecting some dead wood and dry grass, Dee made a fire. Before the sun had sunk, they'd had their meal while still on horseback. The smell of cooking would be just the thing to draw vicious supernatural beasts. However, there was nothing the travelers could do to cover their own scents, nor could they stop the sound of their heartbeats. They could only take the chance that they'd be able to escape the ultra-keen senses of famished monsters and demons. So it's been 2 days. Tomorrow we should hit Clemens, right? Iriya said in a somewhat relieved tone, even as her eyes remained trained on their surroundings. She was referring to the time they'd been traveling since they'd left McRory. For someone expecting relentless pursuit and ambushes, it wasn't surprising she would hope the last 2 days of peace would carry over into the next day. The difference between towns populated with humans and the endless expanse of wilderness was truly like comparing heaven and hell. "Don't go dropping your guard," the hoarse voice said. "Around these parts, the things that live out on the plains change so fast it'd make your head spin. No telling what'll pop up. Though it still beats the woods, or forest, I guess." "It's okay," Meeker said as he laid out his sleeping bag. "From the look of the stars, we're at the northern end of Sector 96. Not many dangerous things up here. Aren't you well informed?" Iriya said playfully, giving him a look of admiration. A broad smile of satisfaction spread across his face. It was always at times like this that something had to interrupt. "Interesting. This is the same squirt who can't do anything wrong." The hoarse voice was immediately muzzled. Dee sat silently by the fire, feeding it branches. "Thank you," Iriya told him. She was grateful he'd cut short the snide remarks. "Sorry. I know I'm useless." Meeker apologized weakly. Though Iriya had spent the last 2 days coaching him in how to take care of the horses and how to use knives and guns, Meeker showed zero aptitude for these things. On the other hand, Iriya's skill drew praise from the hoarse voice. "No one's born that good," it had said. "The girls had magical instruction. Maybe that'd start to explain how she could take down Mitterhaus, eh?" Dee had given no reply. "No problem. Don't worry about it at all," Iriya told the boy, giving him a pat on his little back. Stammering, okay." The boy smiled at her, but immediately looked down at the ground. Apparently the scrutiny made him uncomfortable. Iriya glared at Dee, or rather at his left hand, then looked up at the hunter's face as he tossed something out into the wilderness, saying irately, "Can't you do anything about that thing?" "Would that I could." Once he'd finished throwing things in all 4 directions, Dee squeezed his hand into a fist. Every time he did, a tiny death rattle pierced the night. 10 times it rang out. As the night deepened, the air grew colder. Meeker had been right. They didn't encounter anything dangerous. At least nothing that lived out in the wilderness. The only thing this strategy could be likened to was waves breaking on a beach. So long as the coast was in the distance, they went on forever, closing without a sound. They made a noise when other waves followed after them, but a single wave was silent. The same went for this wave. He'd spread it 3/4 of a mile wide, and then closed in on the group, so they couldn't escape. So it could swallow up every last one of them, and digest them all. It was 50 yards from its target, and the man controlling it was confident of his success. 3 miles away, this spot was beyond even a Dampier's sight. Through a pair of the nobility's binoculars procured from a curio shop, he could see the 3 figures sleeping around the campfire. Just another 50 yards to go. Now he let his stomach bounce. However, a second later, the master of that stomach was gripped by a feeling that something wasn't right. The feeling akin to fear. Though he discharged the contents of his stomach and taken every precaution, his stomach had begun to devour something. It didn't seem possible anyone could detect its presence, its movements, except for D, perhaps. "Go," he bellowed, his cry carrying despair. His stomach shot up like a colossal cloud, and then a vicious pain turned him into a spasm-racked stone. Did he finish it off? At the same time he felt the death tremors on his stomach. He drew his dagger and cut off the esophagus that protruded from his mouth. He was 3 miles off, more than enough distance to make his escape. However, as he got to his feet again, his body was racked by a huge and final tremor. When he thudded to the ground, the arrow that had diagonally pierced his throat from above gleamed faintly and deeply silver in the moonlight. Page break. "Don't move," Dee told her. But as soon as he'd got up and left, Iriya heard the voice of a woman in the distance. At first, she tensed at the thought that it was Lorelei, but she quickly remembered that the sorceress was dead. Besides, this sounded like shouting. She didn't think to call out for Dee. Her warrior's blood raced through her. Making sure that Mika was asleep, she concentrated her gaze in the direction of the voice, and there something like a white mist hovered in the depths of the darkness. On realizing that it was drawing closer, Iriya went for the hilt of her longsword. In less than 2 seconds' time, a woman in a long white robe took shape. She had a countenance so lovely it made even Iriya sigh in spite of herself, and it seemed as if the moonlight illuminated her face alone. "Come." The sweet, sad voice that echoed in the huntress's ears was indeed that of a woman. "Come to me, and I shall make you forget all the pains of this world." Sight and sound. Her brain must have been devastated by the alluring beauty that crept in through those 2 of her senses, because Iriya rose unsteadily to her feet. The woman was right before her. Her arms were spread, and the sleeves of her robe flowing down like the Milky Way. "Come to me, and I shall make you forget everything and anything, like so." Looping her arm around Iriya's back, the beautiful woman smiled. It was at that very instant that the lovely countenance split in a cross shape. The rent portion was a noxious hue, and had patterns that called to mind a nose and eyes. They were unquestionably the petals of a flower, but the petals had the luster of steel, and then the bud that had been her head reared back, preparing to assail the blank-faced Iriya. though it probably intended to swallow not only the huntress's head, but also her entire body. It was unable to do so. When the woman put her arm around Iriya, the huntress's hand had never left her weapon's hilt. And the instant the demonic blossom reared back its deadly head, a horizontal slash mowed through its torso, cleaving it in two. Falling to the ground without a word was the upper half of the gorgeous woman, which quickly became a bizarre tangle of roots, and the lower half, spurting something that could have been either blood or liquid nutrients, also quickly transformed into a weird stalk and several ambulatory roots. Leaping 10 feet away to avoid a fountain of digestive fluid, Iriya landed and let out a deep breath. That was all it took to return her breathing to normal. A second later, Iriya was gazing down at the bisected remains of the monstrous plant as she returned her blade to its scabbard. No sooner had she turned her back than there was a cry of, "Look out behind you!" Even before Iriya caught Miko's words, she was swinging her blade behind her. It was instinct. Before the sword had stopped moving, she leapt off to one side, slashing down through the spot she'd occupied and slicing a stone on the ground in two, and was a whip-like filament that stretched back to the wound in the stock-still lower half of the creature. As its severed portion writhed on the ground, Iriya made a bound for the gravely wounded creature, pulling back its deadly whip. This time splitting it lengthwise, the lower half of the creature collapsed in a heap, transforming into the beautiful woman, as if that were its swan song, and then immediately resuming its true form as it ceased moving. "Are you okay?" her savior asked, racing toward her. Yet the warrior woman seemed ungrateful, as she shouted at him to stay back, continuing to glare down at her foe. "It's dead. You cut its roots off," she heard Miko say. "You're right, but how do you know about this thing?" "Well, it's something called a thrice-split baron. There's not many of them, but they're one of the dangerous creatures found in these parts. Humans rarely run into them, so you don't hear much talk about them. But when they find their prey, they take a similar form to it in order to get closer. I didn't realize that's what it was until it had its arm around you. She sure was pretty. I'm surprised it didn't fool you." "Yeah," Iriya replied with an embarrassed grin, and then she turned to the right. Dee was just coming back. What remained in Iriya's brain of the beauty of that transformed plant monster now melted away like ice. Giving her head a shake to push the gorgeous new countenance out of it, Iriya said to Miko, "You saved me. Thank you. You sure know a lot about frontier creatures, don't you?" "Only what I've read in books," Miko replied bashfully, rubbing the back of his head with a bit of pride. "Well, thanks to that, I'm still alive. You remember that? You saved my life, and I'll be grateful to you for as long as I live." As the boy nodded, the two of them noticed that Dee was looking at them. Though there was no change in his fierce beauty, the two of them had to smile. They got an impression of a different sort of expression. An hour later, Dee found Naja's corpse. His stomach had gone for the pieces of jerky Dee had scattered around, and within days that stomach would be filling the bellies of other creatures in the wilderness. Iriya and Miko exchanged suspicious looks. "A falling out with his partners," Iriya murmured, but Miko shook his head. Memories of the incident, of the demonic insects, which he'd managed to repress until now, rose to the fore. He described what had transpired to Iriya. "In that case, wonder if it means we've got an ally." "Dee?" Any idea who it could be? Although there was no reply, the two of them got the distinct impression a cry of pain had once again risen from Dee's left fist. Although there was no reply, the two of them got the distinct impression a cry of pain had once again risen from Dee's left fist. First part, end.